Crystal Sun, Ancient Lenses, a presentation by Professor Robert Temple. In this lecture, Dr. Temple provides evidence that magnifying lenses, telescopes and optical surveying techniques existed from the time of Old Kingdom Egypt, with magnifying crystals known even in Predynastic times circa 3300 BC. Recorded live at Megalithomania 2007.
Before I show you pretty pictures in a safe mode, I'm just going to change the way I would normally talk about this subject because we're all megalithomaniacs. No, we wouldn't be here, but shh. And so, as I think it was somebody today said that, well, in our last talk, that it's very handy when a megalith is just outside a pub. So I'm going to start with obelisks, not outside pubs, because what I discovered in this book you see before you, which there are a few copies of downstairs, was a forgotten science of the ancient world. And when you know about it, it changes the way you think about religion, culture, mythology, philosophy of antiquity, really throughout the world. And I'm going to begin, however, with things which are made of stone so that everybody feels comfortable. And obelisks are not normally called megaliths, but they are, as we heard earlier, large stones. So therefore, even bigger than the British megaliths would qualify for our special attention. Now, imagine that you are living in Egypt in the Middle or New Kingdom. There were no obelisks in the Old Kingdom, which is an interesting point. Obelisks came in to replace pyramids when the Egyptians could no longer build pyramids. And I'll come to pyramids in a moment. But imagine that you're there and you're really into the sun in a big way, as some of our other megalithic friends were. You worship the sun, in fact, and you call him Ra or Re, depending on how you feel that day. And he's about to rise. And it's a really big deal when the sun gets out of bed because you want to be there to welcome him. And so you're the high priest and you're waiting for the sun to rise, and you've got your other priests and people with you, and you want to sing a hymn to the sun, which is what seems to have happened in many countries. And I'm sure it happened in Britain. And you can't just start the hymn too soon because you've got to get your timing absolutely perfect. If you start singing too soon, your hymn will be over before the sun gets up, and that's not very effective. So timing is everything, and what you do is, especially if you're the high priest, you actually turn your back to the sun. In front of you now is your obelisk, and you look up to the top of the obelisk. Now, we know, and we have the proof of this, that the ancient Egyptian obelisks were tipped in gold. Not necessarily pure gold, it was really a metal, a sort of electrum, a gold-silver alloy type thing, maybe with a bit of copper thrown in just for fun. Anything that was really shiny and reflective. So the sun's coming up, but the rays haven't struck us yet because we're on ground level. However, we're looking at the top of the obelisk, and suddenly, there's a flash at the top of the obelisk because the ray strikes that first. Then we know it's really about to happen. It's like ringing the doorbell. Everybody says, "Oh, right, there's the flash." And then they turn around and start singing, and then they're going to get the timing right. This is what obelisks were for. They were sun flashers that flashed just before the rising of the sun to give you the warning that it was going to happen. And in this book, you can read all the details. But what's much more interesting than that was what happened with the pyramids at Giza before anybody had to make do with obelisks. Just before I go past obelisks, however, I will mention to you what Pliny said they were. Pliny was a Roman author who wrote something called the Natural History. He said that the Egyptians say that obelisks, which we know are made of granite, are meant to be solidified descending rays of the sun. In fact, if you look at an obelisk, that's just what it is, because it's coming down from a point and it's sort of spreading out. And they thought of them as stone solar rays, frozen rays in stone. Interesting. So, now let's go back to the Old Kingdom before anybody had to make do with these things, these substitutes, and look at the pyramids. What was really happening at Giza? Now, you all know that there are casing stones left at the top of the second pyramid, the one that's called the Pyramid of Khafre. They're sort of sitting there. They've gone a bit brown. But Jomar, who went to Egypt with Napoleon in 1798, in his account said that at that time, and that's only a bit more than 200 years ago, said that they were still shiny white at that time. So this goes to say something about the Cairo smog that's made them go sort of sickly looking now, and they don't really reflect very much sunlight. But even as recently as 200 years ago, which after all is 4,500 years after they were put there, they were still very shiny white and reflecting a lot of sun. Now imagine when the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid were completely covered in these white reflecting casing stones. The Great Pyramid had 14,400 casing stones. And don't forget, it covers 13 acres plus. This is a gigantic edifice for those of you who haven't been fortunate enough to actually get there and stand there and let your jaw drop and look up at it. Well, this is a very shiny object. Egypt is not known for its rainstorms, and it's not like it is here. So you've got the sun all the time. Now, it was just too blinding. You know, you couldn't really look at the pyramids because they're just too shiny. Now, why did they do that? I believe that the tip of the Great Pyramid, which, by the way, is missing, was what they call a pyramidion. We've got other pyramidions of other pyramids, but we haven't got that one. Was probably also covered in this gold metal. So it would have been a solar flasher. Every morning when the sun was going to rise in the east, you'd see it flash on the top of the pyramid first. And this was then replicated with these smaller things, these obelisks, in later times, hundreds and hundreds of years later, when they had to make do. But it isn't just the tip of the pyramid that's the really interesting part, because there's something very strange about the pyramids. I mean, besides what you already know to be strange about them. It was first noticed from a balloon, but nobody really noticed it. I've seen it in the balloon photo, but nobody commented on it at the time. It was not until, I think, the 1920s when a British Air Force plane was flying over Giza and took a photo, which was later seen and published for the first time by a chap called Davidson, who wrote a book about the pyramid, where the sun angles was just the right position so that you could see that the south face of the Great Pyramid, which we had all imagined to be smooth, had an indentation. You can see the vertical line, what geometers call the apothem, and it goes in slightly, and that half is in shadow. The other half is in the light. And this is very, very vividly visible from this aerial photograph. But it's not visible from the ground. And if you stand on the ground and you look at the pyramid, it's totally undetectable by the naked eye that there's this irregularity. It's not an irregularity. It's done on purpose, of course. Now, Petrie, when he measured the pyramid very carefully, and you'll get this in the first edition of his book about the pyramid, but the second is greatly condensed, and most of the good stuff is taken out, and that's the one that's been reprinted. He noticed this indentation because he was very meticulous, and so we knew from ground measurements also that there was this going in, but we didn't know what it meant until we got the aerial photograph. Now, imagine that the casing stones are still there, because you see now it doesn't make so much difference because all the stones are dull because they're underneath stones. Imagine it's all shiny white, brand new. What's going to happen? what the Great Pyramid was, apart from all the other things that it also was a way of measuring the year precisely, because it was able to tell you exactly the day of the equinox. Twice a year, both equinoxes. Because that's when the sun rose and was dead on. But in the days preceding, when the sun's coming from one direction and moving to the dead east point, and then for the other equinox coming from the other direction and moving to the dead east point, when it rises, it would make a flash on the westernmost half of the relevant face, that is the north or the south face, whichever the case may be for that particular equinox, because it alternates. And so you'd get the flash, and it would be very brief, because then it would be washed out by the daylight. But so first you get the solar flash on the gold tip, then you'd get the flash on the divided half of either the north or south face, and then you would have daylight and everything's washed out and it's day. So when that flash didn't occur, because everybody's standing there breathlessly waiting, then it's dead on, and there's no flash. That is the equinox. So this is a way of measuring the year precisely. Now, we are all megalithomaniacs, but the Egyptians were calendromaniacs. They had to get the year right. That was their main obsession, the calendar. And later I'll tell you, and the most amazing thing about the calendar, those of you who have read The Crystal Sun are on the inside. But those of you who haven't don't know yet. So this was what was going on. Now there's another one of these things at Giza also, a light well in what's called now the Valley Temple. And that is something to tell precisely the time of day. Exactly at noon, the north and south wall are in total shadow. So that's a sort of noontime indicator. Now the ancient name of Memphis, which is the city that's nearest to Giza, which is almost gone because all the stone's been taken away, but there have been some excavations and we know where it was. The ancient name of that in Egyptian was White Wall. And the reason it's called White Wall, because everything to do with ancient Egypt was to do with light, shadow, and light effects. Now I'm going to tell you about the most amazing discovery I made at Giza. I don't know why nobody has noticed this until I came along, because every year it's been there. Well, not every year, because sometimes you get haze these days. I mean, one year I was there and you couldn't see anything because of the haze. This is merely modern atmospheric problems. But until then, for thousands of years it's been happening, but nobody noticed it. That's because when the Old Kingdom ended, everybody forgot everything. There was 150 years of complete turmoil, and the mobs rioted and rampaged through the Giza Plateau, and they smashed all the statues of Khephren, and they did damage to the Sphinx, which I discuss in my next book, which is very important, actually, what they did there. And they made a mess of everything. For 150 years, there were these floods and droughts and plagues, and everybody was dying, and government collapsed, and there was no law and order, and everything was just a mess. This is known by archaeologists and Egyptologists as the first intermediate period. That's their way of talking about social collapse. So after 150 years, everybody sort of pulled themselves together again, because the floods stopped and the droughts stopped and everybody was dead, and a few people were born, and they started again. And then that's called the Middle Kingdom. So before that's the Old Kingdom. After the Old Kingdom, everybody just lost it. They couldn't build the pyramids anymore. They didn't really know what they were all about. And they sort of struggled to get Egyptian civilization back again. And they did a pretty good job, because the Middle Kingdom is really very interesting. But then they had to fall back on obelisks, as I mentioned. And obelisks were really big and really in during the New Kingdom. But by that time, they'd already become so decadent on the subject that they would sometimes stick an obelisk around just for effect, like a garden ornament. They'd say, let's have an obelisk over there in that corner. I think it would look kind of nice, kind of decorative obelisks. So they were losing the plot by that time. But they were making up for it in their other ways because they had the Temple of Karnak and you know, the sun going in there and striking the inner sanctum one day of the year. You know, this is big stuff. The sunrise and then the sunset effects too. But we'll come to that later because I've even got some nice pretty pictures of that for you. But we've got the tradition here continuing. People say that the Freemasons say that they derive their traditions from the ancient Egyptians. And everybody says, oh, go on, that's just a lot of talk. However, I've got a really surprising thing to tell you. Once again, those of you who have read this book will know this already. That's not many of you, I expect. And so, in the 17th century, it was discovered and published in a book by Martin Lister, my bedside reading, that he had taken down a piece of the original steeple of Chartres Cathedral and had discovered that the original, because there's two steeples, I'm talking about the 13th century one, not the 16th century one. In other words, the lower one. He had discovered that it was made of lodestone. The entire steeple, original steeple of Chartres Cathedral is a gigantic lodestone, magnetic. Now, this is important. If you read this book, you'll discover that the ancient Egyptians were seriously into lodestones. So what we've got here is a survival in a Gothic cathedral in Europe of the tradition of the tip of a sacred edifice being somehow very weird. It's no longer reflecting the sun, but it's a supermagnet. That's just a little interesting tidbit about how the traditions have secretly continued. And I don't think we should poo-poo all this business of secret continuing of traditions. I think that, although in a deeply degraded form, a lot of really good stuff has actually survived among the Freemasons. And, of course, the perennial tradition, as Keith's friend, Kathleen Rain, was always calling it, has always preserved these traditions. What is the Hermetic tradition? What is the Platonic tradition? What are all of these traditions, these subterranean currents of esotericism about, if not the preservation of the eternal truths throughout the ages of barbarism, because every age is an age of barbarism, because most people are barbarians. I mean, this is a savage world. Some of the tamer denizens are here today because we're actually interested in megaliths, and we're not out there at the disco yet. So I mention all this by way of a prelude. And I then want to come to another sacred edifice, and that is Stonehenge, which has been mentioned many times, that wonderful place. In my book, I explain how I came to the conclusion, on the basis of the passage from Diodorus Siculus, which Gerald Ponting showed on a slide earlier, that this temple of the Hyperboreans, which everybody admits must have been in Britain, was Stonehenge. I'm sorry, Gerald, I don't think it was Callanish, but good try. The early, most of the standard translations of Diodorus Siculus describe the temple as being a round temple. But the Greek text actually says, and the quote shown by Gerald is correctly translated, they say that it's a spherical temple. The Greek word is spheroides, spherical. Now, a lot of classicists edited that out because, how can you have a temple that's spherical? Well, what that means is domed. Now, think about that. The reason why I think that, well, one of the reasons I think that Stonehenge is the one that's being mentioned here, and by the way, Diodorus took this passage from another writer called Hecataeus of Abdera, whose work is lost and survives only in quotations, as this one. The reason why I think it's Stonehenge, that it was spherical, is because it's the only one of these places that's got trilithons. Now, what are the trilithons for? I mean, they look great. It's a terrific effect. And if you're not playing football, as one of the earlier slides showed, which is one interpretation, then there must be some purpose for these trilithons other than this wonderful architectural thrill they give us. What if they were the base for a platform to cover Stonehenge? So I came up with this idea that Stonehenge was a spherical temple because it actually had a roof of perishable materials. It could be wattle, it could be wood, you name it. And that there would have been a platform. You know the trilithon that's the highest one, apparently it's got a couple of mortises which are not explained. Extra mortises. Now what if they were for the securing of a platform, an observation platform? Imagine you're the high priest and you're standing up higher. You get to see the sun first. It's the same thing as with the obelisks, because we know also from Diodorus, who quoted Hecataeus, that the other thing that was going on when the sun was rising, and this would be the Solstice Rising, which my good friend John Michel and I had, and Olivia, we all had the wonderful thrill of actually seeing once. And it really does come over the hailstone, just like they say. You've got to get your hymn going at the same time, at the right time, because we know that they were singing, because that's what the text tells us, that they had the kithra players, and they had the chorus. And they were singing hymns to the sun, because this is really important. This is the solstice. But you can't start the hymn too soon. You've got to know the sun's really coming. So if you've got your observation platform and your high priest is up there and he can give the high sign and everybody starts singing because it's about to happen. Timing is so important for these sacred ceremonies. So if you've got your observation platform there and the rest of it is a sort of, not a complete dome, but imagine Mount Palomar, and it's open to the east. Everybody is sheltered, and if it's winter after all, if you're standing there in the bad weather, or if it's raining, then you're not going to see much sun. But imagine that this is a domed edifice. That would be the spherical temple. Now, having come up with all that and described it, I was just browsing in a secondhand bookstore, which is my incurable habit, and I found an old 1937 issue of Antiquity magazine, which is the thing that's contributed to, as you know, by seriously orthodox archaeologists who would never say anything like I've just said. And what did I find? I found an article in there by some chap saying that he thought Stonehenge had a dome on it made of perishable materials, and he even had a picture of it, which I'll show you in a slide. I thought, and he came up to this idea on a completely different basis, because he didn't even know the passage in Diodorus, and he wasn't thinking along those lines at all. He was thinking of other reasons why he thought Stonehenge had a roof, a domed roof. So he came up with it for his reason. I came up with it for my reason based on the old text. And if two people come at the same thing and get the same answer for two different reasons, and there's an old text to back it up as well, maybe we're onto something. And the trilithons are there, and they would have held up a platform, and they would have supported a dome, so maybe this is what it was going on. Well, that's my little introductory spiel. And I'm now going to become a slightly more orthodox and show you some slides, but I don't seem to have or is it the thing in my pocket? The little gizmo. I do have a laser pointer. I'll shine it if you're bad. But where's my thing? Ah, thank you. So this is the great book, which everybody should read. And that is my mind when I'm tired. It's just teasing. So, but don't worry, it's not going to happen. I know you're all traumatized, but it's really not going to happen again. So, I got into this crazy subject way back in 1967. I thought I was going to go straight, but I was sitting chatting to some various friends described in the book, and one of them, who was a very distinguished professor called Derek Price, said to me that he knew of this lens in the British Museum that was sort of Assyrian or Babylonian or something, but nobody really knew. And anyway, it wasn't on view anymore because they'd removed it because too many people were showing interest in it. And if there's one thing that they don't want is anybody to show interest in anything in the British Museum. So in 1883, this was published. This is a drawing of this lens. Well, you can see it's flat there. That's the base, even though that's up. And this is a slightly convex top. You have to flip it over. And it's got this sort of crack in it, which everybody thought, well, that's a natural flaw in the quartz. This is made of rock crystal, by the way, also known as quartz. However, that's by no means true, but this is what they thought. And so this was the first photograph published in 1930 of this lens. Now, I've inspected this lens. I've got a whole chapter about this lens in here. It's called the Layard lens because it was discovered in 1849 by Austin Henry Layard, who was the guy who excavated the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud, where this was found in the throne room of King Sargon II. Not the first, second. And that's not important. This is a side view that shows you the flat base and the slightly convex front. Now, I took this photo. I wasn't supposed to, but this is the, I'm sorry, this is the telegraph. I know that will offend some of you. It's not the Guardian, I'm sorry. As you can see, it sort of magnifies, but in a really kind of weird and wonky way. So what does that mean exactly? Now, it perfectly fits what's known as the orbital aperture. You didn't know you had one of those, but you've actually got two. The orbital aperture. And in fact, in about 1900, standard sizes were made for optometrists to make lenses for spectacles. And this is a perfect standard British lens of about 1900. The only trouble is that it was excavated at Nimrud, and it dates from 750 BC. Slight problem. And it's made of rock crystal, which is a lot harder to grind than glass. And it would have taken a long time. I expect that most of you grind crystal at home. This is Glastonbury. But probably you've not tried to grind that many lenses. And here you see, you thought I was teasing, but I'm not. The one up there on the right, which is called regular oval, that's for regular guys. That is the standard size as published in this optometrist's handbook of about 1900. And it's exactly the shape of this Assyrian lens. So clearly something's going on here. Now, before we go any further, I have to tell you the basic things about lenses. I mean, half of you wear spectacles. I can see some of you wearing them now. So you know that they exist, but you probably don't know how they work exactly. There's 5 kinds of lenses. Now, when they've got a flat bit, that's called a plane, so it's called plano. So if it bulges, which is convex, it's plano-convex. If it comes in, which is concave, it's called plano-concave. If it bulges on both sides, like a lot of people, especially in America, those people are called obese. That is a biconvex lens. The other one is called biconcave, and there are no ancient examples of that. And the final one, it's really sort of a concave lens with a convex bit beyond. That's called a convex meniscus lens. There actually is one of those made of rock crystal that was excavated from the Minoan civilization on Crete by Sir Arthur Evans. Now, with the exception of D, which is the 4th one, All of the others are represented in ancient lenses, which I've examined. And I have to tell you that if you were to ask most archaeologists, were there ancient lenses? Of course not. Don't be ridiculous. It's the same problem that poor old Keith has had with his Platonic solids in Edinburgh. And so many of us have had. People will not see it. There are over 450 ancient optical artifacts which I have personally examined. Several of them are on public display in the British Museum. Now, the Layard lens is back, by the way. It has been since the 70s. And there are Greek ones and others. They're in museums all over the world. You can trip over ancient lenses. They're just everywhere. I even own one, a Greek one. I mean, they're just anybody's. And yet, all these ancient lenses, both crystal and glass, because the Romans used glass, they don't exist. Oh, no. No, they don't exist because we don't want them to exist, do we? 450 of the bloody things. When I started, I had the one that you've been looking at, the Layard lens. I studied it so hard, and other people have studied it. Let me tell you just how weird the Layard lens really is. It goes way beyond the 5 standard lenses. The reason, first of all, those cracks and things are due to pressure. I was able to prove that it once was a completely transparent, absolutely perfect and flawless piece of crystal. So don't worry. It was just perfect in its day. Mind you, we all age. And if you'd spent 2,500 years underground, you'd look pretty rough too. But that lens is not an ordinary magnifier, nor is it something just for making a fire by refracting the sun's rays. That lens was made for an individual case of astigmatism. It was what we call, because I'm also a sort of pretend can't pronounce it, to do with eyes. It is toroidally ground. That means it was ground unevenly on purpose. Now the base is absolutely perfectly flat. I've measured that. I hope I'm still being magnified. I've measured it very, very carefully because I have the spherometers and all the gear to measure all these things. And I've been all over the world measuring and studying and photographing lenses like a loony because I spent 30, 35 years. I lost track. Since 1967, I was writing this damn thing, which was finally published in 2000. That proves I must be some kind of fanatic. But I kept finding more lenses. How do you stop? I just had to stop in the end. I said, well, I can't go on like this. 450, I drew the line. And so I can tell you that from all the lenses I've studied, very few of them are so carefully made that they're absolutely perfectly flat on the plano side. It's really, really unusual. Somebody took incredible care. So they wouldn't then just make the convex side all sort of wonky by mistake, especially as we know the thing was mounted in gold and it was found in the king's throne room, and it was obviously not necessarily for that king, but from some king that he killed and he captured his booty, is what we think, actually. In fact, it was even suggested to me by one Assyriologist who said, please don't ever mention my name, but I think that it belonged to King Hosea of Israel, who was conquered by Sargon II, and he grabbed all his stuff and took it back and stashed it in his throne room. So he was probably the astigmatic. Now that was made by expert craftsmen. I mean, this is rocket science to make this kind of thing. A toroidally ground lens for a case of astigmatism. You could go out into the street today and you could find an astigmatic somewhere, maybe not in Glastonbury, because we see too clearly here. But if you went to some dimly lit place like, say, Bristol, where there's too much rough life going on, you'd find an astigmatic in the streets there, and his eyesight would perfectly match the Layard lens. But you'd have to get the one who matches, because every astigmatic case varies, you see. And so the Lerner lens magnifies 2 times here, and 1.25 there, and 1.5 there, and it's all kind of irregular, because that's what astigmatic eyes do. These are unreliable people, astigmatics. Never rely on them, because they see things differently than we do. Now, this is hard to see, but these 2 lenses which have been placed in this chap's eyes are from Carthage. 16 lenses have been excavated at Carthage, and most of them are glass, a few are rock crystal. The glass ones were all perfectly transparent when excavated, but they go iridescent and become opaque with exposure to air. So by the time this picture was taken, you couldn't see through these anymore. But these are perfect plano convex lenses that were found in the mummy wrappings of a guy who was buried in Carthage, and they were obviously his spectacles. Now, when I say spectacles, what they didn't have was anything remotely approaching my space helmet that I've got, something that kind of like goes around your ears. Looping around the ears was a medieval invention of spectacles. It's quite a recent thing that happened in Europe. So it's very handy to be able to put your specs around your ears. But at this time, it was all more on the order of kind of lorgnettes that you'd hold up, sometimes just a monocle. And here are various photos of the Carthaginian lenses, those bright, transparent ones over there on the right, the small ones, those are rock crystal because they don't discolor in the air. These glass ones, you can see they've got this layer of discoloration on them. That's because they've gone that way, because they were dug up, poor things. And these are the crystal ones on top of a map of Carthage, just to show you how beautiful they are. These are sort of pretty pictures, just to let you know it's really Carthage and I'm not pretending. And this is a close-up of what I was telling you about, the iridescence that happens on the surface of the glass. It's a chemical decomposition that happens with the oxygen. Well, it feels great. Oh, do that again. I like that.
I am a professional, so don't try this yourself.
No, I'm not going to ask you any more about that. Okay. So I think we're coming to the ends of into the Carthaginian lenses. No, we got more. But we're going to, God, we've got these Carthaginians, there's no stopping them. This is why the Romans wanted to eliminate the place. There's just no end of them. That's a beautiful shot of the crystal one down there. Now these magnify, these old lenses, and some of the glass ones you still can see through, and they magnify like a modern magnifying glass. And one thing that they were used for was for gem cutting. People doing fine work, gem cutters and craftsmen had to have these things. They also used glass, or originally crystal, but that was too expensive, glass globes filled with water, and suspended them, and they looked through that. And this is how all this small stuff was done by the ancient craftsmen. Because just as you reach your peak, and you get into your 40s, and you become the great master craftsman of all time, and nobody's ever made anything as wonderful as you've made, your eyes begin to go. And you become what's called presbyopic, which is not a religion, it's what happens to your lenses. And that's why we go long-sighted, those of us who aren't myopic, and have to have specs. Well, they didn't want to retire at 40, they wanted to go on working, so that these things were developed for them. And then readers. You can run these things along a papyrus or a parchment or whatever it may be, and it just magnifies. Or you can hold it slightly above, depends on your lens. And you can go on reading or carving your gems and whatever until your 80s, if you live that long. People had to have them. Now this is not a Carthaginian one. I'm trying to remember where this is from. Somewhere nice. And this one was a Roman one. It was intact when it was excavated. That's the Mainz lens, which is no longer in Mainz, it's now in Vienna. You can't trust the Austrians either. Look at Hitler. And they're always taking things from Germany back to Austria. And then they dropped it. And then they tried to stick it back together again, and this is what resulted. But I've got the excavation report, which I translated from German, and this is all in the book, all the details. And that was once, it survived thousands of years, and then it was dropped in a museum. Now this is in the British Museum. This is Egyptian. Well, Egyptian from the Greek period. It's Greco-Roman, but it's glass. Now this is, you can see from this side view, a perfect plano-convex lens. Magnification about 2 to 2.5 times. Beautiful lens, but of course it's also gone opaque, but it wasn't when it was dug up. And this was excavated by Petrie, I believe, at Tunis. It's one of the 2 Tunis lenses. And it's in the, I think it's on display actually in the British Museum. So they've got 2 Egyptian ones, they've got the Assyrian one, and they've got various Greek ones, all on public display. But if you go in there and you say to anybody in the British Museum, do you have any ancient lenses? Oh, no. No. They would call this a lentoid. That's like calling all of us humanoids because we look like we might be human, but we couldn't be. So a lentoid is something that can't possibly be a lens, even though it looks like one, but so we call it a lentoid. So that means it can't vote. Now, Schliemann, good old Schliemann, I wish he had a slightly less slithery name, but the man who discovered Troy, he discovered 49 lenses. He excavated 49 lenses at Troy. Not 1, not 2, not 10, 49 of the damn things, all made of rock crystal. And unfortunately, we have a slight problem here. I'm going to have to use this super tool in order to show you something that's only barely visible under these inferior lighting conditions. You see this one here. These are Trojan lenses. Strain your eyes if you've got your specs. And this is a hole, a circular perforation punched through the middle of the lens. Now, to show you how lacking in fundamental optical knowledge archaeologists can be, I've read reports about this that said, well, first of all, these are lentoids. But then, even worse, there's several of them got holes in the middle, which makes them useless. You can't use a lens with a hole in the middle. It's not a lens anymore. I mean, who's going to use a lens with a hole in the middle? But that shows how stupid they are, because that's one of mankind's most brilliant inventions. It magnifies perfectly around the center. You can see everything. And you have a hole in the middle to put your engraving tool. So if you're carving your gem, you hold your lens and you stick your cutter through the middle hole. You can still see everything perfectly magnified, and you can put your tool through the center of the lens. But the archaeologists know so little about optics that they don't realize that it still magnifies even though it's got a hole in the middle. Now I know that those of us who have holes in the head can't think anymore, but lenses can still see if they have holes in them. And so he found 49 of these. Now then they vanished because what happened? The Second World War, and they were all in Berlin. During the bad old days, we used to have an East German cleaning lady, and she had relatives over there. And she would go to East Germany, and I would send her on secret missions to go to the museum in Berlin and try to befriend the very sour commissars who were in charge of things in the East Berlin Museum, snarling types, And she'd try to get friendly with them and speak local dialect and practically give them sauerkraut and say, what's happened to the lenses from Troy? And they would get stony-faced and they'd say, destroyed by American bombs in the war. Well, of course, that's a load of balls, because what happened was they were taken away by the Red Army, along with all the Trojan gold, and they're now in Russia. And now they've all been photographed, and there's a book about the Trojan gold, and it's got photos of the lentoids in it. I highly recommend it, because I was denied access. I tried and tried. I got all sorts of distinguished people to help me, really seriously distinguished people to help me. I was getting even diplomatic help to try to get access to study the Trojan lenses. No, that's not. Because you see, they're sensitive, because they think that the thin end of the wedge, if anybody gets too interested in the lenses, they want the lenses back in Germany because they belong in Germany. And then as soon as we give them the lenses, then they want the gold, and we're going to keep that gold. So it's hopeless. Anyway, that's the Trojan lenses. Now, Olivia and I had tremendous fun because we found this in a basement. It was excavated in the city of London. It's Roman, by a chap called, I forget who excavated it exactly, but it was acquired by this chap called Cuming, C-U-M-I-N-G. And many of you may not know, there's this wonderful, obscure little museum in London called the Cuny Museum. And I knew from old publications in the Victorian times that this thing had been found. Half a lens, because the other half, it's broken, it's glass. In fact, green glass, Roman glass. Because they were casting these things, mass producing them. And they often got broken and they got thrown away. And so this half was dug up. So we went to the Cuny Museum, which is, it's indescribable, really. But try going to the basement. So we went down there, where nothing is cataloged, and we were looking for this lens. Talk about a needle in the haystack. And we found it. And the curators were absolutely thrilled, because we'd found their lens, their missing lens, that had got lost 100 years earlier in boxes of stuff. That shows how Olivia and I are very, very, very determined. So we're very proud that we've rediscovered the Cuny lens, which is from London, a Roman lens. It's about 2,000 years old. So now we move to Athens. And if you go to Athens Museum and you say, have you got any ancient lenses? Oh, no. And the deputy director of the Athens Archaeological Museum even published an article about how he didn't have any lenses in his museum. So if you go into the Mycenaean room, it's full of lenses. And they're in cases anybody could see them. So I made them get them out, and I took this photo to show. This is a Mycenaean lens, and they have Minoan ones of crystal. You can see how it's magnifying. So they're just everywhere. And now this one, we're jumping to Cairo. This is a bit of a world tour for you. And it's free, and it's carbon friendly. So this one was in a case in the Cairo Museum. Now this is from Karanis, which was a Ptolemaic Greek city just on the north of the Fayum, south of Cairo. You go through a bit of desert, and then you come to this gigantic oasis known as the Fayum. Lovely place. And just at the beginning of it, off the road on the left, you can see all the ruined bit. It was this wonderful town of Karanis, and they had a glass industry there, and they mass-produced glass lenses. And this one, which is known as the Cairo Lens, and these photographs are all taken on top of my notes that I carry around with me. You can see it magnifying, because it's still transparent even though it's made of glass. And it's done incredibly well because it hasn't gone off in the air. And it was in an open cabinet, and it's been sitting there all this time, and nobody ever noticed it. And in fact, the people in the Cairo Museum, who couldn't have been more helpful, found it for me quicker than any European museum could ever have done. I mean, people say the Egyptians are not efficient. They were hyper efficient. They found that thing within seconds. And we went running along to the cabinet, and they snipped the wire, and they opened the thing, and they put a table and a bench out for me, and they roped it off so all the tourists had to go around. And I sat there, and I was thrilled to bits because I was allowed to take all the pictures while the chief of the section was sitting beside me. We were having a great time. Things are a bit more relaxed out that way. And so this is the Cairo lens, another one of the Egyptian ones. Now, this is really interesting. This is from Ephesus. This is also in the British Museum, but it's not on display. They've got several of these. They've got several crystal lenses from excavated in Ephesus sitting in the British Museum in the classical department. And if you're really nice to them, they might let you see them. So this one, I took this photograph to show you because you just wouldn't believe it unless you could see it with your own eyes. This is a reducing rather than a magnifying lens. That's from people who are myopic because they need things to be smaller, whereas most of us, getting older, need things to be bigger. But myopics have to have lenses like this. So the ancient Greeks were making concave lenses, because to get this, you have to have a concave one instead of a convex one. And I found over 39 concave lenses from the whole Aegean area, the coast of Turkey and Greece and the Greek islands and so on, all made of rock crystal. An incredible engineering feat, actually, to produce them. And this is the visual proof that it does what I say it does. It reduces the size of the letters by 75%. I've measured it. That's pretty bloody good for something that's maybe 600-700 BC. And now we're getting closer to home. Don't get too excited. This is British. Now, the other thing that Diodorus Siculus said about the Spherical Temple, which I believe to be Stonehenge, is that when you were there, they had a way of making the moon seem to be closer. And you could see that it had mountains on it. What does that mean? I believe it means that they had a telescope and that the whole purpose of Stonehenge was not just watching the sun come up, but it was for astronomical observation of the moon with telescopes, rudimentary ones. I have found lots of ancient British crystal lenses. And for those of you who haven't ever tried to make a telescope, if you've got a lot of lenses sitting around, all you have to do is you pick up one with one hand, and you pick up one with another hand, and you try looking through two at once. You've got a telescope. That's what a telescope is. Now, you have an upside-down image, and if you want to make it right side up, you need a third lens, which is called a rectifying lens, to sort of flip it over again. But if you're observing the moon, it doesn't matter, because who cares if the moon's upside down? So what they had was, I have no doubt, rudimentary telescope at Stonehenge, through which they observed the moon as if it were closer, exactly as Diodorus says in this text, which he quoted from Hecataeus, who actually visited Britain and saw it with his own eyes. And I have found the British lenses to prove this. And this is one of them. Now, this is an incredibly weird lens. First of all, you can see that it's magnifying about 4 times. This is a really, really good magnifier. Now, these lenses are all preserved, not in any archaeological collections. This one actually once belonged to Sir Hans Sloane, who founded the British Museum. And they're in mineralogical collections. That's why nobody could find them. I can't tell you how many years I looked for them. This one's in the Natural History Museum, Mineralogy Department. There are more in the Sedgwick Geology Museum in Cambridge. And that's where all the British lenses have got. That's where they've ended up. Because they're considered mineral specimens. Because nobody will admit that they're lenses. The archaeologists don't want to have anything to do with them. Because it's against the way things are meant to be, you see. So, now let me tell you what's so wonderful about this one. I went and studied the Sloan lenses at the Natural History Museum quite early on, and then after I found them, and then I thought, later I went back, I thought, I've got to just look at them again. I want to make a few more notes, because my measuring techniques had improved by then, and I wanted more data. And my book's full of data. If you're into data, you really like that. So I went back to get more data. And they'd moved them into this room, which was very dark. There was almost no light. I mean, it was really dark. When I'd first seen them, it was in a very brightly lit room, and I could see everything fine. I said, how am I going to look at my lenses? I can barely see to walk. I'm tripping over the chair to get to the desk, for God's sake. Well, there's nothing we can do, reconstruction and the workmen and... So I said, well, I'll have to make do, and they brought me a lamp and another lamp on the other side, and I was trying to feel my way in the dark to look at my lenses in these impossible conditions. But what a stroke of luck! What a stroke of luck that I had a dark room, because I made a fundamental discovery which I would normally never have made. What did people do before electricity? They spent their whole lives after the sun went down in dark rooms. That's why they went to bed early, and they had the candles and the lamps, but it was all pretty dark. So imagine you're any time before now, before electricity, before specs, and you want to be able to magnify and read or do your work or whatever, and you need the magnification, but there's not enough light. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you had a light source built into your magnifier? Guess what? This gathers in the ambient light from all the faint lamps in the room and illuminates as it magnifies to enable you to read what is beneath the lens, and it slides along on the page because it's got a flat base. It's a magnifying illuminator or an illuminating magnifier. I've never quite made up my mind which to call it. And this is one of the most brilliant inventions of all time. There you are in antiquity, and it's dark. You just got a little light from the fire or a candle or something. You can magnify and illuminate at the same time, so you can more or less work in the dark by one candle. Isn't that great? Now, this had a tremendous result in terms of religion, philosophy, and theology, because this phenomenon, which I stumbled upon because there was no light one day in the Natural History Museum in London with the British lens, explained to me why the Pythagoreans thought that the sun was a gigantic crystal ball. I have a whole chapter. The reason why the book is called The Crystal Sun, it's not just a pretty title. There's a whole chapter in there called The Crystal Sun, which explains that the sun was literally believed to be a gigantic crystal ball by certain people in ancient times, and that this was preserved by the Pythagorean Philolaus. And I discovered this in a very strange way from a treatise that was attributed to Plutarch, but was never translated by the Loeb series, and it was really by Aetius. And I only found it in an 18th century book that I had sitting on a high shelf. It's a long shaggy dog story, which is in the book. You can read that if you're into that kind of thing. But in it, I discovered that Philolaus, who's the earliest known Pythagorean writer, apart from Pythagoras himself, if you assume that he actually wrote anything, and we're not sure. Philolaus was long before Plato, and his works only survive in fragments. He claimed, and this obviously came from earlier traditions in Egypt, that the sun was not a ball of fire, it was a gigantic crystal ball larger than the earth. And what it did was it gathered in the ambient light from the surrounding universe. The earth went round it, by the way, because Philolaus had a heliocentric theory that the earth went round the sun. But it didn't go around a fireball, it went around a gigantic crystal ball. This crystal ball took in the ambient light from the cosmos, which was sort of fiery, you see, and focused it and refracted it and beamed it to the earth. Just like this thing does on the page. Because they had seen this phenomenon with crystal and how it condensed and gathered in surrounding light and beamed it down, and they decided that that's what the sun was doing. Hence the crystal sun. They literally believed that the sun was a giant crystal ball. Well, nobody had ever known this before. This is one of many discoveries that I'm able to report. And so it had a tremendous theological implication, because all those Gnostic texts, you know, the Nag Hammadi texts and so on, the Apocryphon of John and all of those more mystical ones, and the Hermetic tracts, and I quote some of the Hermetic texts, one of the Asclepius texts, they refer to things along these lines, and they have these hierarchies of light phenomena and different levels of beings which are emanated from other beings, supernatural, you know, and it gets more and more like that. And a lot of it is light theology. These are light effects. And all of these things were looked upon very mystically. And so then I discovered in Macrobius, one of the Neoplatonist writers, in his commentary on the Dream of Scipio, that he said that the Neoplatonists believed that human souls were light particles. Well, all the Gnostic texts say that. They're either spermata, which means seeds of light, or they're spinthair, which means sparks of light. It's the same thing, interchangeable terminology. And we are all meant to be light sparks that have come and embodied in these incarnations that we go through, you see, and then we die and our light spark goes on and then it comes back again. And so Macrobius said that we all start as spheres. What does that remind you of? That's just what Keith was saying today, that your first experience was as a sphere. But according to the Neoplatonists, that was even truer than Keith thinks, and it's a pity he's had to go catch a train and can't hear this, because they said that we started out as light spheres and that we descended as cones of light. In conum is the actual word in phrase in Macrobius, as light cones, and we came into physical bodies as light cones. So we're descending as light. And all the light theology, which then carried on and was an undercurrent of Christianity and is embodied in central to the whole of the Gnostic religious tradition and the Manichaeans and other traditions, is to do with the theology of light based upon these light phenomena of things like this which people had witnessed. And the ancient Egyptians were into this in a big way because they had the Uraeus coming out of the forehead of the Pharaoh. Now the Uraeus, the Egyptian word for serpent is phenu. It made its way into Greek as phanes. And that was the serpent of light which issued forth from the globe of water, because the Egyptians they were masters of the art of crystal, and they could make vases and globes of crystal. And we have a lot of Egyptian crystal vases from the first dynasty. This is really goes back. And they would fill them with water. And one of the things that really got everybody going for thousands of years was they would hold, in ancient times, a crystal globe, but of course in Roman times, many glass globes, which were cheap, and fill them with water up to the sun. The light would come through and it would start a fire. But they would feel the globe and the water would still be cold. So they've got two enigmas here. First of all, water is creating fire, but they're supposed to be separate elements. You know, how does water make fire? And then the water is cold and the fire is hot. So you've got cold creating heat and water creating fire. Well, this is really something to get ancient people worked up. And so this was built into all the religious traditions as a great mystery. So the Uraeus serpent is the serpent of fire coming out of the brow of the Pharaoh, because he represents the eye of Horus, which I'll come onto a bit in more detail in a moment later. But the Eye of Horus was more than one thing. But one of the things it was, as is described very clearly in the pyramid texts, was something containing water from which fire came. It was a crystal globe full of water held up to the sun, and it created fire. And this was the Uraeus serpent coming out of the Pharaoh's brow. Now, there's an awful lot more of this, which I can't go into because it would take all day. But I'm just giving you a flavor of it. And now, here we have the evidence that the Egyptians had magnifying glasses made of crystal at least as early as the Predynastic period of 3300 BC. Now, the reason why we know that is because these are ivory knife handles that were excavated by a German Egyptologist I know called Dreyer. And these carvings, which are actually, strangely enough, of Canaanites, because the Egyptians were really into Canaanites, they are less than a millimeter across, and they cannot be seen without quite a strong magnifying glass. Dreyer told me that in order to clean these images, he used the point of a pin. And these are blown up, magnified photos. But these carvings, and here are some more, are microscopic. You can't see them with the naked eye. They could only be carved with magnifying glasses. Well, we know the Egyptians had a lot of quartz sitting around, and they were making it into vases and cups and stuff. So it's clear that they had magnifying lenses in 3300 BC. Now, this is very important. Here's more of these Canaanites. They just loved Canaanites. I guess because they brought tribute. So I think that those are not Canaanites, those are lions. They're probably native. Right. It's really important because I have actually found ancient Egyptian lenses from the 4th and 5th dynasties in these wooden statues, these eyes, and a lot of them are in the Cairo Museum. And there's one in the Louvre of a scribe sitting there holding his thing with his legs folded. You can go to the Louvre and see in Paris with your own eyes the crystal eyes, which are perfect plano-convex magnifying lenses. And it's a pity that this is all washed out by the light here, but the centers of the eyes, because the sides are limestone, the centers are perfect crystal magnifying lenses to give this quality of life, you see, to the statues. Isn't this an eerie one? He's called King Hor. Don't get the wrong idea. He didn't do that kind of thing. Look at those eyes. See how eerie it is to have crystal eyes. Here is the guy they call the Sheikh. He's also from the 5th dynasty. He was...
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.
Side. Well, I'll talk about that in a moment. That's Greek. Now, what's the importance of the fact that I have actually found ancient crystal lenses, magnifying lenses, from the 4th and 5th dynasties in Egypt, from what's commonly called the Pyramid Age? Well, I'll tell you, it explains how they were able to achieve the perfect alignments of the pyramids, because they had, all you have to do is hold two like this. They had theodolites. Because without theodolites, you cannot do the precision alignments to build those pyramids. It's impossible without optical alignments with optical instruments of theodolites, which can be very simple and basic. That's how they achieved the fantastic accuracy to be able to build the Great Pyramid and to align it so perfectly north and south that there's just almost negligible deviation. Today we couldn't build the Great Pyramid that was going to do that. That's a very naughty speaker. But then so am I. today we could not build the Great Pyramid and align it like that. We don't have that kind of expertise. So what did they had to have the lenses, and I found the lenses. So now we know. And then in the book there's a lot of other stuff about how they did it and the instruments they were using with the lenses and all of that, which I'm going to refer you to the book for. Now, this also is important in Britain because our good friend Alexander Thom, who some of us were actually fortunate enough to meet because we're old enough to have been around, said very clearly in, I think it was megalithic lunar observatories, when he was doing his studies, he said, the precision of observation of the lunar movement was so incredible that if you had one of those strings that you stretch and you moved it by slightly twitching your finger, it was a movement greater than the precision with which the lunar movement was measured for some of the megalithic rings. And it's very clear that he believed that only with optical instruments was it possible to construct many of the megalithic remains in Britain. As I've already shown you, I have discovered ancient British lenses. So they had theodolites, and that's how they did it. They didn't just have a telescope to sort of look at the moon and say, beautiful moon. They were using it to get the precise alignments for the megaliths. And we megalithomaniacs need to know that. They also had another very clever invention here in Britain. They had magnifying lenses from which they extruded or carved points. They're so weird looking, and they sit there on their sides with little points, and they kind of, if you tap them, they sort of roll along, you know. And they're resting on, I call them resting points. It's an integral part of the crystal that's been allowed to stick out in a point to allow the thing to remain so that it's not flat, but it's magnifying, and you can see it. If you put it in front of it, it's at an angle, and it's resting on its resting point, but you can get under it. And what you can do is you can take your cutting tool, if you're carving, and slip it under the resting point and do your carving and still see through the lens at the same time. It's the same result as what you get with the hole in the lens in Troy of sticking your tool through the hole. So you see, these are workman's tools. And they're unbelievably clever. Now, I examined over 100 crystal lenses in Sweden. Well, I also examined a few in Finland. They're all, the Eastern Vikings were making these. They had a huge industry. And the Swedish Vikings had carried optical technology so far that they were able to create little things smaller than raindrops made of ground crystal, which magnified 2 times. It's unbelievable, and a lot of the microscopic work to do with gold work and so on of the Vikings was done through these lenses. One of the centers of manufacture was the island of Gotland, where I've written a report on all the lenses of Gotland, which is published in Swedish for those of you who want to read that. Now, this is a very interesting lens. It's a Greek one, which has a carving on the flat base. I own this one. I bought it from a friend who got it from an antiquities dealer 100 years ago, whatever. He died a long time ago. And this appears to be a carving of a winged Prometheus. Now, the carving has been dated by the British Museum people as being 6th or 7th century BC. So we know the carving was done in the 6th or 7th century BC. We don't know how much older the lens was, because probably the lens was turned into a jewel later. But in fact, if you turn it over, the presence of this carving doesn't interfere with the magnification. So you might think it would, in the same way that you would think that having a hole in the middle would make it not work. But you can still, it gets in the way a bit if you're really seriously trying to read. But what he's carrying in his hands here, don't forget that Prometheus is the fire bringer. There's an enormous section of my book devoted to these lenses being used to light the fires on the sacred altars, because bringing fire from heaven is what you do with a lens. So you ignite the offering on the altar with the clean, pure, sacred fire that comes direct from heaven. You don't use flints because that's dirty. And you use the pure fire. And so that's what the Vestal virgins were doing all the time, because they weren't doing anything else. And so they were guarding the sacred flame as well as themselves, and they were also kindling it when it went out. And they were doing it, as Plutarch records, with reflecting mirrors in their case. So we know that fires, especially sacred fires, are being kindled by focused sunlight coming through lenses or concentrated by mirrors way, way back in antiquity. And so Prometheus, in mythology, is the guy who brings fire from heaven to mankind, and he is then punished for it. And he brought it in a narthex tube. Well, now, the narthex tube, the narthex was a sort of giant fennel, which is now extinct, which had a long stalk, and it was used to mount lenses. On the cover of the book is a 5th century BC Greek pot fragment showing a Greek looking through a telescope. It's been on exhibition for many years in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. Nobody has ever said, hey, that guy's looking through a telescope. They just say, that guy can't be looking through a telescope. It's called consensus blindness. It can't be true, therefore I refuse to see it. But what is Prometheus doing in this carving? He's got a lens in each hand, if you could see it more carefully. He's carrying little tiny globes, one in each hand. And what do you do if you look through two of them at once? You're looking through a telescope. He brought fire to heaven. This is an optical illusion. In a narthex tube, that is a telescope. And of course, he brought the fire from heaven by refracting the rays of the sun through a lens. It's all optical lore. The Cyclops with his one eye, that's the same kind of optical lore. You can run through Greek mythology, and all the things that puzzled you suddenly become clear. There he is. What's this man doing? 5th century BC, excavated on the Acropolis. In the Acropolis Museum for years. I took the photo. There was very bad lighting with my Nikon, and Olivia sacrificed herself in the cause of science. She did this, and I leaned on her shoulders and I said, stay still. I had to get this photograph with a 2-second exposure because the light was so poor through a glass case. Came out rather well. You'd never know from this, but if you look at the book, it's clear. And here is the kind of thing I mean. This is the equivalent of an narthex tube. This is actually the stem of that gigantium weed, that sort of giant poisonous parsley thing that grows wild in Britain. That's 8 feet tall. That it gives you a rash if you rub up against it. Something gigantium. What is it? Giant hogweed. Yeah, I don't know why it's named hogweed, but anyway, this just gives you the impression of you take a section of that, and that's about the same size as what the old extinct giant fennel, or the Greek word of which is narthex, used to be like, which was perfect for hollowing out and using to mount your telescope lenses in. Now, this is in a German museum, in fact, in Bonn, and Roman collections are full of little tiny glass globes, which are miscatalogued as makeup containers. And they have little tiny openings in them that you can just about get a pin through. And so most of the museums in Germany which have all this Roman glass sitting around are very formal, but in Bonn it's rather small. And I got chatting with the woman and I said, I can tell you what one of these little globes is for. Would you like to know? Well, yes, but it's a makeup container to contain schmuck. Great word, isn't it? And or is it schmink? I forget. And, or is it schmuck? And I said, no, I'll show you. Will you let me fill it with water? So I went over to the sink where we wash our hands from all the dirty things. And she said, well, all right, but don't tell anybody. You'll have to get the water out before my boss comes. So I filled it with water, and I held it up, and I said, look, it magnifies, doesn't it? I said, it's a little miniature glass globe, and the Romans, they made millions of them, and then you stick them in your pocket and carry them around, and when you want to see something, you get your little globe out and you read through it. Or you use it to start a fire. And the surgeons, or chirurgeons, to use an ancient name, they used to cauterize wounds for soldiers in the battlefield by having little pocket magnifiers to focus the rays of the sun. They'd burn the wound, which of course killed the bacteria, and that's the only way you could survive a battle in warfare, would be to have your wound burnt, cauterized by the focused rays of the sun. And they had little magnifiers, so they either had magnifying glasses, or in fact they carried these with them, which are cheap and cheerful. You just put some water in and you're away. So this is by the light of a 60 watt light bulb. It's focusing the light of a 60 watt lamp, and it's making that intense focused light from something as faint as that. Imagine what it would do in the sun. Zoop. You'd ignite a piece of paper in 2 or 3 seconds. So the woman was astounded. Oh, well, and then I said, I'm going to miss my train. So she said, well, quick, get the water out. I said, slight problem. I turned it upside down, and the water doesn't come out because of surface tension inside the sphere. And and she said, well, shake it quick, because, I got to close. Shaking violently, no matter how violently you shake it, you can't get the water out. I said, I have just proved to you that it is not a makeup container, because you can't get anything out, even water, certainly not makeup. Right, proved that point. So I left her with her globe filled with water, and I said, look, my advice to you is take a pin and slowly let it dribble along the pin, and after about 10 minutes, the water will have drained out. I hope she did it, but I didn't dare go back to ask. And there it is again, the same little thing. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands of these. You could buy them for a couple of pence. Anybody could have one. But no archaeologist knows what these little glass globes are, but I have demonstrated it. Now here is a burning glass made by Samuel Parker of Fleet Street. And the top lens there is 3 feet wide. This is so powerful that it could melt gold in 3 seconds. It's got another lens to focus even more. This was one of the greatest solar lenses to create fire ever made in history. Probably the best refracting lens for creating fire that was ever constructed in history. And it was in 1840, it was purchased by the Emperor of China and had it shipped to Beijing, to the Forbidden City, to his palace. And I tried, because I've spent a lot of time in China, I started the process of trying to find this thing. They've got tens of thousands of bits and pieces of old clocks and all kind of stuff that the emperor's collected, a lot of it from Europe. And I used to carry this picture around with me and say to my various professor friends, do you know anybody in the Forbidden City who could look for this? And they just laughed. Look for that? How many hundreds of buildings do you think we've got stuffed full of things? So I never found it, and I realized it would have taken weeks, and they probably would have failed. But it's sitting there somewhere in China. One day it'll turn up. Made in London. Now, this was made by Comte de Buffon in the 18th century. This is a very interesting object in the Musée des Arts et Métiers in Paris, where it's got an array of miniature mirrors, reflecting mirrors, and what you do is you angle them all in such a way with things like this, and there's another one, a bigger one, which has, they're all little gizmos that you can angle them so that you adjust the focus of the beam of each mirror separately onto the point that you wish to ignite. And Buffon was able to ignite wood within seconds at the distance of 150 feet with these mirrors, burning mirrors, two of which survive in Paris. And this kind of thing was what was done by Archimedes at Syracuse when the Romans were invading Sicily. He burnt the Roman fleet. And everybody I've got a whole chapter about, I call it the quest for the death ray, because the ancient Greeks, and then again in the Byzantines, perfected the use of burning mirrors to destroy ships in the harbor who were attacking their cities. And Archimedes really did burn the Roman fleet with burning mirrors. And I knew a man who has now died called Ioannis Sakas in Athens, who in the 1970s carried out a famous experiment using the Greek Navy. He got all the sailors to line up, and he got them 70 sailors holding 3-foot-high polished copper mirrors, and they all focused a beam on a small boat in a harbor at the Piraeus. And within, I think, 8 seconds, smoke started rising, and within 3 minutes, that boat was in flames. And this was just by sunlight from sailors holding mirrors. And the way Archimedes did this was he got all the soldiers to line up on the city wall. They'd crouch down, and then they'd pop up on cue, and they'd all sort of be trained, and they'd get the solar ray, and they'd all focus it on that ship, and it would go up in flames within seconds. This is how he got rid of the Roman fleet. Archimedes' mirror. And this was perfected, and these are 18th century ones. There were 17th century ones. There's a long, long history of burning mirrors, which have now been superseded by laser beams. And this is a 17th century drawing by Athanasius Kircher, in which, because he also burnt things at 150 feet distance with burning mirrors. This is a very complicated picture of one, too complicated to explain. This is upside down. I'll tell you that because you wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't told you, would you? And this is another 17th century picture attempting to show how Archimedes might have done it. And this one is not upside down, and this is another one showing Archimedes burning the ship, another 17th century version. But this is imagining it going through a refracting lens, whereas in fact we really know that it was mirrors, not lenses, that he used. And here we have a pretty picture showing the fire being lit on the altar of Vesta in Rome by the light of the sun. The sun is actually making sure this is working, and it's going through a lens, whereas in fact the Vestal versions actually used mirrors. Same thing. Now, we're running out of time, but I just want you to see that these were excavated on the island of Delos, now called Delos, and these show ancient depictions of a pyramid with reflecting rays from the tip, which was a sacred symbol. This the sun sitting on top of the pyramid with the rays reflecting from the tip, as I was telling you at the beginning of my chat. And here we have just a picture from the New Kingdom showing a pyramidal top to a tomb. There's the mummy is inside the mummy case. This is Anubis, and this is the widow crying. And we have the two eyes of Ra, and we have the golden tip from which the rays of Ra are reflected, symbolically shown there. This is not a functional one. This is a symbolic one. And here we have the American $1 bill reverse side, and the Masonic symbol. You get the message. The Masons are very serious about this kind of thing. This is the tip of the pyramid with the solar rays and the eye of the sun. Don't mess with them. And this was a wonderful example of synchronicity. I went to Karnak And one of the obelisks there, which had a carving which, if you could see here, you can't. In the book, you can. Just here is a picture of Horus, which is the falcon. And so this hawk or falcon came and sat on top of the picture of himself, which is there. Just at the time I wanted to take the picture, I thought that was rather nice, of the god Horus, kind of make himself available in such a way. And here is just a typical obelisk, and don't pay any attention to that column because it's Pompey's pillar and it's not important to us. And this is what Luxor used to look like when it had both obelisks at each side of its gates. One was removed and is now in the Place de la Concorde. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about that one. Have you ever noticed that under Mitterrand, who was a Mason, think about this, he put the gold tip back on the obelisk in the Place de la Concorde? Just ponder that one. It's back. It's one of these. I forget. I think it's the one on that side because this one's still there. Or maybe it's the one on this side and that one's still there. This is the entrance to the Temple of Luxor, ancient Thebes. And it was very naughty, but you know, the guys running Egypt at that time said to this Frenchman that they wanted to be chummy with, they said, "Oh, take one. We got plenty." And this is a photo I took in the Temple of Hathor, Dendera. I just wanted to show you that we have the rays of the sun. This you can't see very well here, but this is the sun here, sending its rays down onto the face of Hathor. And this is a shower of obelisks, mini obelisks. It goes back to what Pliny said, that to the Egyptians an obelisk was a solar ray solidified in stone. And this is a shower of obelisks, solar rays coming down. This actually depicts the heliacal rising of Sirius. I'm getting into the Sirius mystery if I'm not careful. Represented here by Hathor. We mustn't get distracted by a different book. And so this is an extremely ancient thing which I found in the Museum of Argos in Greece. This was excavated from the incredibly ancient city of Lerna, Lerna, which was pre-Minoan. I mean, it's so ancient. It was not. They weren't Greeks. Nobody even knows who they were. They're just the Lerna people. And this was their sacred altar. It's really big. It's like as big as this platform. And it's got carved in it this strange shape. You may notice that that's the double axe of the Minoans, the Labris. Well, let me just show you what the double axe really is. I took this photo of focusing the solar rays through a lens. And you get if you do it hold it at a certain angle, you get this perfect axe shape. And so, I'll go back. What they were doing here is you get a double axe formation with one side slightly larger than the other. If you have a lens refracting the rays of the sun onto the altar, this is the sacred altar of Lerna. And what they would do is they would fill this receptacle with kindling wood, and then they would take a lens which must have been really gigantic, unless they must have had to, this is so huge they would have had to be using a mirror, actually. They would focus the solar rays, and the pattern would be in that exact shape. And you can see that the indentation has flame patterns around the edge. And what they were doing was making a depression in the altar, the exact shape of the focused rays as they hit the altar, so that no rays were going outside the area of the sacred flame. The boundary of flames was the boundary of the focused light, and the kindling would burst into flame within seconds, and that would be the altar with the sacred flame, and then you'd give your offerings to the gods using the fire from heaven. And this goes back to, I think, 3,500 BC. We're talking really ancient here. Now, this is a quaint picture from the 18th century from some French thing or other. It's the only pretty picture I ever found which gives an impression of the sun as a crystal sun, gathering in the ambient light and focusing it down on Earth. It's not meant to be taken seriously. It's a pretty picture, just for evocation's sake. Now we're coming to the end, but I just want you to see that this was excavated. This is from the time of Cheops. We know that because it's actually got his name on it there in a serac. And the importance of this, Olivia calls this Cheops' coffee cup. It was a sacred measure. It was a standard measure of volume, liquid volume, or corn measure. That's what this is. It's a sacred measure. But the interesting part is that it's got this ribbed exterior, which we believe represents the stem of the extinct giant fennel, which is the only surviving evidence that suggests that it was ribbed, because nobody's ever seen it that's alive today. And because they would have used that to make this, in the same way that the Chinese use bamboo all the time, or things like that. This is a window grate from Karnak that shows the slits used to let the solar rays in. Now this is actually sideways, I'm sorry, but this is a light effect that we discovered. Let me just try and explain this to you because it is so weird. You have to sort of imagine that you're, which way are we? We're this way. Yeah, here we are. You have to sort of bend like this. And this is the pharaoh standing here. This is his head. This is the chapel of Ramses III at Karnak, which is off on the right as you go into Karnak. And this is Ramses the pharaoh standing here, and that's his head. And this is his arm, and he is holding an empty offering tray. And for just a few minutes every day, he makes a light offering on that tray. This is one of the many optical effects. When all the ceilings were still in place and everything, and all the buildings were still intact in ancient Egypt, it was full of all these light tricks. And this one is cut in a special way to resemble the feather of Ma'at, which represents cosmic order and is the feather that's placed in the scales to weigh the deceased soul. And this is the photo I took of the rays actually coming in to make that effect through this intact original window. Now here we have just a quick reference to those of you who all read the Da Vinci Code. This is the solar line for measuring the date of Easter. And this is New Grange on the morning of the winter solstice. At 8:58 a.m., the sun strikes the inner sanctum at New Grange in Ireland. You all know that, I'm sure. St. Peter's with an obelisk, just to let you know. And this is Karnak. That's Karnak. I can't tell you about it. This is the sun coming into Karnak. And we're coming to an end. In fact, I'm going to stop. That is a walnut shell to show miniature work with lenses. And that is Stonehenge with a roof. 1937.
This has been a Megalithomania audio production. For more information, visit megalithomania.co.uk.